Now, welcome to the committee, and you have 5 minutes to Mr. Case of Hawaii.
Good morning, Mr. Chair, ranking member, and colleagues from an early Hawaii, and mahalo for the opportunity to testify before you today as a former member of this committee in support of a fiscally responsible budget. At the outset, let me say very clearly that I reject the increasingly popular view that federal deficits and debt no longer matter, that we can somehow continue to endlessly spend far more than our revenues, endlessly increase our national debt with no consequence. Our debt now exceeds $28 trillion, doubling in just the last decade alone. Our debt to GDP ratio, measuring the ability of our economy to sustain that debt, is at its second highest level ever, exceeded only by World War II. Our own nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office, in its recent Budget and Economic Outlook 2021 to 2031, published before the passage of the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan, projects that in just another decade, debt will equal 107% of GDP, the highest in our history, and within another 2 decades, almost 200% of GDP. Even with record low interest rates, gross interest outlays increased 26% over the past decade, and we are spending more on interest than key investments in our future, such as transportation infrastructure and K-12 education. We can and should debate reasonable deficit and debt levels and whether to address them on the revenue or the expense side. Those are debates that need to be had. But I hope we can all at least agree that the current escalation in our federal debt is unsustainable over time and will increasingly harm our country across the board. I think the underlying challenge is our collective inability or unwillingness to recognize and prioritize fiscal responsibility and sustainability. Whether budgets, taxes, spending, pay-go, or any other fiscal issue, we're increasingly simply avoiding sound budgetary principles and practices and accelerating the decline in our nation's finances. More directly, several of our nation's critical trust funds, including the Medicare Hospital Insurance Trust Fund, the Social Security Disability Insurance and Social Security Old Age and Survivors Insurance, are now projected to run out of money within the next decade plus, much sooner than earlier projected as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. Against this backdrop, it is simply irresponsible to ignore our nation's fiscal state, and even more critical that our budget face up to these realities. We do not have to implement immediate draconian and counterproductive spending cuts and/or tax increases to do so. We can take balanced, preferably bipartisan steps to reinstitute fiscal responsibility and accountability, as long as we do so now. I want to highlight some basic budget reforms that I believe can contribute. First, and most basically, I believe we must produce a detailed budget. It is a mark of deterioration over time in both finances and accountability that we must even debate this most basic step. Second, we must pursue efforts to responsibly utilize limited taxpayer resources. Unfortunately, terms such as, quote, root out waste, fraud, and abuse, unquote, and, quote, eliminate duplicative programs, unquote, have become proxies for political ping pong. But the desire to spend wisely should be, and I believe is, universal. As one step, last Congress, we enacted the Taxpayers' Right to Know Act, authored by committee member Jim Cooper, to require federal agencies to report fully on their federal program activities and publish that information online for direct public accountability. Further steps include strengthening the federal inspectors general offices, which were denigrated under the previous administration. Third, we should establish balanced bipartisan procedures that require us to evaluate and make the hard decisions necessary for true fiscal responsibility and sustainability. I have again co-introduced the Sustainable Budget Act to do so for our overall fiscal state, and will soon reintroduce the Trust Act, which focuses on the specific actions necessary to save our trust fund programs. Lastly, while we pursue these initiatives, we must avoid digging ourselves any deeper than absolutely compelled by crisis circumstances through abiding by our pay-go rules and statutes. Paying for progress is not stopping progress. We have time and again proven that progress and fiscal responsibility are not mutually exclusive, as demonstrated most tellingly by the paid-for Affordable Care Act. And we have proven that we can take the difficult decisions, our spending constraints and revenue enhancement on spending constraints and revenue enhancement necessary to do so, and successfully explain to our public why those decisions are necessary. I urge this committee to lead our way back to responsible budgeting and sustainable budgets. Thank you very much for your consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Case, for your testimony. Does any member have a question of Mr. Case? Ranking member.
Just mainly a comment for Mr. Case. Would love for you to serve on the budget committee. So we definitely could use your voice. Look at the deficits and items. So hopefully you get back here someday.
Thank you very much for that comment. I'm busy on appropriations, but it's critical all across the board, ranking member. This should not be a partisan issue. I think we can all find a way to debate this and reach reasoned decisions, tough decisions, but reasoned decisions in a way that will place our budget back on a sustainable path.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any other member wish to ask a question?